Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the Startup Society's podcast. Today, we are joined by a very special guest. You probably know him. His name is Dr. Parag Khanna. He's the managing partner at Future Maps and author of several prestigious books, including Connectography, The Future is Asian, and now Move. Parag, how are you doing today?
Great. Nice to see you, Joe.
Absolutely. We're glad to have you on the show. So I'd like to start by talking about your new book. And for some people, your book is premised off of two potentially counterintuitive assumptions. One, that in a post-COVID world, people are going to be more mobile. And two, this might be counterintuitive for some, population will be decreasing rather than increasing. Can you sort of explain how this relates to your book?
Sure. Well, I mean, both of those trends aren't necessarily counterintuitive in that both are rooted in the pre-pandemic reality. Global mobility was accelerating, going back really over the past decades. And that means both, most certainly internationally. So in 2019, we had a record number of cross-border, migrations, movements, travelers, 1.5 billion people. The stock of expatriates had also reached a record high, 275 million people. Now, remember, as a share of the total population, that is roughly has quadrupled since a century ago. So we are talking about a massively larger, sort of final number of people who are capable and have been crossing borders than, quite frankly, ever before in history. So the notion that the pandemic, as sort of epiphenomenal as it is, would simply stall, freeze, and reverse that forever is obviously nonsense, right? And in many ways, I'm sure we'll get into this, but the innovations in how we manage mobility in the wake of the pandemic will probably make future migration mobility more seamless than it has been. And that's something that I strongly advocate for in the book. But let's first get to the second point you made around demographics. Now, here, clearly, the pandemic significantly accelerates the pre-pandemic trend, which is the fertility crash. The deceleration of fertility and peak fertility was reached in 1968. So the rate of growth in the world population has been decelerating since literally the late 1960s. Now, we've had, on top of that, two very significant baby busts. One is the global financial crisis of 2008, and the second is now with COVID. Now, the GFC baby bust was bad enough. It was so bad that by 2009, we were already able to forecast that many American colleges would go bankrupt in the year 2026 because they would have no students coming in 17 or 18 years after the financial crisis. That's how precise you can know and make your predictions. Now, let me give you an even more devastating fact. The COVID baby bust is far more severe than the GFC baby bust, and it's still going on. It is so severe that the entire global generation alpha, which is today's babies, infants, toddlers, still to be fully born up to the year 2025 is how we measure Generation Alpha. Generation Alpha is going to be smaller than Generation Z on a worldwide basis. So for the first time in recorded history or meaningful history, the next generation is not going to be as large as the one before it. And that's literally, for all intents and purposes, obviously it happened during the Black Death, but for all intents and purposes, this has really never happened before. So we are living through the most profound demographic inflection point in the history of the human species right now. You and I, right now, we're living through it. And it is peak humanity. So peak humanity is one of the key assumptions and points of departure in the book, because suddenly the world population is not an exponentially growing Malthusian crisis in the making. Instead, we have a very finite stock of people, and suddenly human beings are quite precious. And we actually want to preserve the maximum, sort of the sustainability and viability of the human species. And therefore, we have to think very hard about the distribution and geography and location of those human beings so they actually stay alive. And all of this is happening, of course, as climate change accelerates. And you have a mass casualty phenomena on a regular basis, whether they be, whether they be epidemiological or climatological. And already the largest number of refugees and migrants in the world are driven by climate change. So hence, all of that is a long-winded way of both answering your question and explaining why I felt it was necessary to write a book about the future of human geography amidst the baby bust and climate change.
So just to sum it up, and you said it very well, but just to sum it up in my head, the essential assumptions is because northern countries that are traditionally fairly well off, they're depleting in population. And at the same time, you have climate refugees from the global south. They need to find other venues. There is both demand on the migrants and on the country end for more migrants to move northward as a result of climate change. And the result is a tremendous amount of, well, for one, migration, but also geopolitical, economic, and cultural change.
Well, you're very rightly inferring the conclusions that I come to and the kind of the agenda in a way that is developed over the course of the book for viewing, sort of this situation, this constellation of challenges and conditions as an opportunity to thread the needle and to recirculate people in a way that benefits our societies, because it is a particular irony that the most livable geographies in the world in the Northern Hemisphere are simultaneously the most rapidly depopulating, while the labor force that those very same Northern Hemispheric livable countries need are trapped behind borders in increasingly unlivable places. So if you could culturally stomach and digest large-scale mass migrations and politically, but not just culturally and politically, but let's remember also ecologically, because we, of course, have done a very poor job of sustainably cultivating habitats. So if you have mass migrations, it should not come at the cost of destroying the precious remaining livable spaces that we have. Instead, it has to be done according to a new technological and commercial sort of model in order to preserve those ecosystems. And that's basically what I call civilization 3.0 in the book. It's a mobile civilization because survival requires mobility and migration and relocation, but it has to be sustainable in terms of the technologies that we use to house ourselves and the infrastructures that we build for the remaining population that exists.
So you map out 4 different possible, but also parallel scenarios on what would result from all of this. And this civilization 3.0 that you mentioned, it could be all of them at once, it could be some of them, and they could be varying levels of violence and discomfort as a consequence of this change. What do you believe is the best path forward to reduce the amount of friction of transitioning to this new world in an effective way? Because I think that's the real answer, because the core of your book is it's already too late on ecological level. It's probably too late on a political and economic level. How do we reduce the harm and make sure we can get to point A to point B?
Right. And, we don't necessarily, if you were to ascribe equal probability to the 4 scenarios in the book, then if I were you, I'd pack my bags and move to Stockholm. Because the odds are not good. 3 of the 4 scenarios in the book are relatively pessimistic, and negative. So there's only one scenario that's actually positive. And again, it's a very, very tight needle to thread, which is what I call Northern Lights. And that's the one that calls for a gradual sort of premeditated or planned, relocation of many vulnerable people around the world to climate propitious areas, the places I call climate oases. And again, to do so with new toolkits, infrastructurally and even politically, in order to ensure that we don't kind of, again, destroy those habitats. So, achieving that Northern Lights scenario is a very, very significant stretch. But the thing about scenarios is not that any one of them is ruled out as impossible, because in truth, all 4 of them are happening right now. So Canada is the Northern Lights scenario. It's happening in the real world right now as we speak. In fact, it's happening, 1,000 miles north of you. Canada takes in 400,000 new migrants every single year, many of them from developing countries, all of them on a pathway to citizenship. And that's really remarkable. Pound for pound, there's no country on earth, even remotely, as generous. But other countries will are learning that lesson, that if you actually want to have your future tax base, if you want to import talent, if you want to diversify your economy, if you want to maintain that demographic balance within your society, you do have to be open to significant amounts of migration. And Canada is doing this not in a reactive way, but in a proactive, premeditated way. And it's brilliant. They're pulling it off very, very well. Justin Trudeau just got reelected. There isn't really a Donald Trump of Canada, right? But again, now multiculturalism has been a part of their national identity and ethos since Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was prime minister of the country. He's the one who made multiculturalism the national ideology in many ways. So it's a unique situation. But we can see from the case of Germany that it's possible even in a country with a very, historically ethno-nationalist sense of self. Because in Germany today, you also have, it's increasingly becoming almost something of a melting pot, at least urban Germany is. And that's not something you would have expected even 20 years ago. And they've pulled it off. And of course, the new coalition that's forming in Germany is a center-left coalition, and the far-right parties have been obliterated. So, they've really matured and become more cosmopolitan in this regard, and I think that's very impressive. So, Canada doing it, you may say, is easy. Germany doing it is not at all easy, and they've pulled it off, and they're a very important strategic country, and they've done so right under the nose of all of the populists and, quite frankly, all of the media and commentariat that believe that right-wing ethno-nationalist chauvinism and the revenge of nationalism is the dominant meme in the world. And I think that these two countries, Western societies, no less, prove very, very capably that it's not. Let's also remember that Brexit has flamed out, right? It's easier to migrate to the United Kingdom right now than it was before Brexit. That's a legal statement. It's a factual legal statement I'm making. It's not a matter of opinion, and that's a big pie in the face of, British right-wing nationalists, right? I mean, the fact is a Bangladeshi can pretty much show up in London right now because they're so desperate for foreign labor and people in the, just to stimulate the economy. So, and then of course, America, where Trump is not president anymore, and Biden is trying to provide a pathway to citizenship for 13 or whatever million undocumented migrants. He wants to massively expand the H-1B visa quota and so on and so forth. So, I very, very vigorously reject the notion that that there is some archetype of a strongman nationalist regime and society under the thumb of that figure that in a uniform way is anti-immigrant, xenophobic, and populist, and also in a, if you will, in a sort of in a long-lasting way as well, where there's a real continuity to that point of view, because almost no regime actually meets that test. And to the extent that they do, they're not exactly desirable places to emulate, right? But mostly they're places that have just screwed up and the policies have changed. So if you look at Italy, the names you've heard the most, almost among others, but Matteo Salvini and Viktor Orban. If I had $1 for every time I've heard the names Matteo Salvini and Viktor Orban in the last 8 years, I would certainly have retired by now on all the Bitcoin I could have bought. But the fact is, these are such irrelevant figures in the grand scheme of things and the sweep of history. And I particularly pick on Matteo Salvini in the book because he is, in fact, such an utter moron. He was, his idea of a family first Italian, sort of fertility policy and social policy, which basically is a polite way of saying women stay home and make babies, was such an affront to Italian women that he caused an exodus of Italian women from Italy. So it's hard to think of another person who's done more to undermine their own agenda. And that's in fact what always happens. So why do we look at Turkey and Russia and India and see the revenge of, sort of nationalism as if it's a uniform phenomenon in their societies, when those are three of the largest origin countries of emigration. Their people don't agree with them. Why do we give them so much attention? Why don't we shine the cameras? Why don't we point the cameras at their airports and look at all the young Russians, Indians, and Turks who are getting the hell out of those countries? And so I absolutely demand that we have a little bit of intellectual rigor and accountability in these conversations, and we not pretend that there's anything meaningful about this notion of quote unquote civilizational states, other than China. But China is an imperial formation, and it was always a civilizational state. So it's ludicrous to think of that as something new.
So there's definitely a good argument to be made that migration can happen, and there are regimes out there that are fully accepting of migrants. But as you say in your own book, a fundamental logic of sovereignty under a Westphalian system is control of borders. So what happens to the concept of sovereignty once this happens? And you allude to this a little bit in your book, thinking beyond sovereignty as it is, or a new Hanseatic League. And the Hanseatic League, beyond, not being nation states, but cities, they had sovereigns that, weren't cities or nations. Hanse means guild, which is association of people. What will the concept of sovereignty be in this possibly new Hanseatic scenario, or this post-move scenario?
Right. So I would tackle this on two levels. The first level is more broadly around thinking beyond sovereignty to stewardship or custodianship, but this applies more to ecological assets than it does to, genuine legal violations of a country's sovereignty. So, for example, you can't actually impose migrants upon a country. And one of the things I go to great pains to point out is that even if I'm a cosmopolitan believer, the fact is that the one thing about which you will never have agreement among sovereign governments is a global right to free mobility. In fact, one of the only vestiges of sovereignty that meaningfully remains in the world today is a country's ability to close its borders to the movement of people. You can't block pollution or pathogens or terrorists or cyber hacks, but you can more or less, even poor countries, stop the inflow of people. And I don't think that's actually going to change. So when I talk about sort of beyond sovereignty, I don't mean the elimination of sovereignty. I'm really just talking about self-interested international cooperation in the sense of environmental stewardship. And that's actually not really a new phenomenon at this point either. And I point to many examples of countries, either individually or in a cross-border sense, establishing ecological preservation zones, and doing so in a way, that is obviously benefits their own environmental sustainability. But now on the other point about sovereignty when it comes to migration, or rather the sort of city-state level. I mean, so devolution is really what you're talking about, which is obviously an area that interests us a great deal. And devolution is a very powerful and persistent trend in the world, because cities and provinces have not only risen in terms of their demographic clout and their economic clout, but as the kind of information asymmetry is eroded, those cities can also really keep better tabs on their fiscal sort of situation and relationship between kind of core and periphery, and really either demand to retain or to have recirculated back to them more of their kind of taxable revenue. And that's why you see British Columbia in Canada, Western Australia, the Catalans in Spain, the Scots in England, in Great Britain. I mean, everyone is pushing for more and more autonomy. And that's how you get to your new Hanseatic League scenario, both through the partnerships among sovereign states that are small and agile, and are willing to work together to actually simply mutually recognize each other's systems and legal codes and certifications. So a driver's license in Scotland gets recognized in Estonia, a medical certification in Finland gets recognized in Iceland or Canada, And those are the platform ways in which you'll form, and obviously people with a visa to one country are automatically admitted to the other countries because they trust each other's vetting requirements. This sort of stuff happens all the time. The master of this right now in the world is the United Arab Emirates. The UAE doesn't want to spend its own money to replicate, duplicate all the public services that other governments are spending their own budgets on. Basically, they're saying, look, if you qualified to get a visa to the United States, someone's checked you out. So why don't we just accept that and we'll let you in too? Done. Easy as that. And they're also building kind of, sort of digital escrows in a way. They're saying that if they recognize your African university degree, because they've checked out that it's not fake, you'll now have your kind of education passport housed, quote unquote, in your kind of, your locker, your digital locker, of which the UAE government is nominally the custodian, and all the data that you put in there is verified by them. And then hopefully other governments are going to trust the UAE because of their rising standards. And that becomes, what I call governance as a service. So governance as a digital service is, I think, a growing trend and a very important trend. And I genuinely hope, and this is obviously one of the principal proposals in the book, is that mobility follows that pattern. I just read today that a company called Atlas, ATLYS, was just funded by Andreessen Horowitz and does precisely this. It kind of, more or less puts on a one platform the requirements of any country vis-a-vis any other country in terms of their visa applications, and it'll harmonize and standardize and do all the paperwork for you in an automated way. So if we can get to that one, sort of platform where every country more or less wants similar-ish data about you, your educational history, travel history, criminal records, financial statements, vaccine certification, and so forth. And they'll let you in if you provide the right materials. Well, that becomes a transnational platform rather than, you, the guy from Ecuador, having to spend your 2 months of income to fly to Peru just to go to a place where there is, a US consulate and spend hundreds of dollars that you don't have to stand behind bulletproof glass, only to be told that you didn't cross this T or dot this I, and you've got to go back and do all the forms again. And then even after having done all of that, you'll come back 1 month later and they will have rejected you. Because that's kind of the way things work right now. And that's
my wife is from Colombia, and she has to go through some enormous silliness. So the scenario is there is still retained sovereignty, and there's residency that mimics Singapore and Dubai, but there's this interoperable platform that allows you to plug into these new jurisdictions and reside there. And that's very interesting. But how do you prevent that platform from becoming a Sesame credit type system?
Well, starting with just the residency platform, I think this has been one of the areas where, again, it's really contradicted the notion that the pandemic represents a rupture from recent history and that you will have these persistent kind of lockdowns and a new, much more sedentary lifestyle emerging. I mean, that may be fine for you. You can move to North Carolina or you can move to Boise, Idaho. And you can say, hey, I found the perfect spot. It's climate resilient. I have tech talent. I can work remotely and make a great salary and live in a low tax place and still stay in my own country. And that's just great. I have some news for you. You're not representative of the human population. Yeah. And in my work, I'm always concerned with the 8 billion people in the world. And if you're fortunate enough to live in Ottawa, Canada, by a lake, I don't need to worry about you. I'm worried about everyone else who is not you. So the fact that 75 countries, instead of just 2 countries in 2019, now 75 countries have these nomad visa programs, and they're saying, hey, come one, come all. You could be Indian, you could be, Nigerian, but fill out this paperwork and we'll give you a chance. If you've got some skills, just come and live here. We need people renting our Airbnbs. We need people, drinking coffee in our cafes. We just need bodies, because the services industry, that so many of us in the hospitality industry that so many countries depend on has been, emasculated, eviscerated by the pandemic. So I view this to be a very positive trend, and it will foster kind of a race to the top in terms of places competing to offer the best services. So low tax, affordable housing, fast broadband, and all of these kinds of things. And I think that's great. So it's a real, buyer's market if you belong to the millennial or Gen Z generation and have, kind of whatever skill. You don't really have to be a software developer or a Bitcoin miner. You could actually just be a barista, because these countries need that too. And so I'm bullish on global youth to the extent that they are not, sort of don't have passports that are completely off limits, like Afghanistan, or Paraguay. And to the extent that that they have, sort of a modicum of skills that they can and represent themselves in a visa application to get out of where they are and get to where they're going.
Absolutely. I think it's a great idea. I guess I was just asking about, the privacy element of having this one platform that, has government requirements and they just have more and more. But I get you, like it's necessary from lived experience and just looking, there needs to be more mobility and easier.
No, it's not what governments have, but so, if you have this on the blockchain, it's situational. You have to update your data on a regular basis, and a government can require that you do. And all of this can be on a secure app, in a way. So it really is a blockchain effort or foundation that's required, where you're allowing access as needed or granting access to that information to the party that requires it. I mean, it does take two to tango, and obviously all of this information is in any case online already in some way, shape, or form, like your credit score or whatever. So you might as well, in your own best interest, if you are the one who is dependent on being granted that access, you might as well play along. It's going to be better for your future to do so.
So another key component of this is urbanism, obviously, because of migration means new places to live. And one of the suggested solutions is something that we at Startup Society we promote all the time, which is creation of new cities, startup cities. But as you've mentioned in the book and elsewhere, these startup cities, they're great. They can be a district, they can be essentially a village, but they haven't gotten to the point of scale and really demonstrated their success. Since you've been looking at these experiments for so long, what is a key thing that developers of these new cities should be focusing on to get them to the point where they really are globally important?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's going to be case by case ultimately, just like urbanization itself, right? Urbanization in America and urbanization in Latin America didn't happen at the same time, didn't happen for the same reasons, but they happened. So I think you want to kind of focus on case by case. So some smart city projects have become larger than others. Some have completely faltered. Geography matters, demographics matter. Of course, I've been to Suzhou or I've been to Tianjin Eco City. In the latter case, in the early days when it was still kind of just a shell, but now it's a fully fledged kind of, large, heavily populated, almost suburb, you might say, of a very large city. But again, this is the part of the point, in a case like China, you can pull this off because you have a large population, you have long-term clarity over what the vision is, and you have one common sort of law across them. And I think a lot of the conversations sort of are kind of geography free. And to some degree, this is the problem with just talking about kind of picking a spot on the map, not quite throwing darts, but picking a spot on the map and saying, there's going to be a new city here, because it kind of neglects the reality that geography matters, proximity to large markets matters, that kind of thing, geopolitical conditions matter, and so forth. So you can't just say Shenzhen and have a new Shenzhen. The fact is that Shenzhen, there's a lot of things about Shenzhen that can't be replicated anywhere else, even if you were to do everything legally that Shenzhen did, because wherever it is that you're trying to replicate Shenzhen is not going to have a fraction of the population of the Pearl River Delta that Shenzhen had access to, nor the proximity to an incredibly wealthy city like Hong Kong, which was poised to invest in it. So, there's an alchemy associated with geography and demographics and the particular industries that you want to cultivate. When I started going to these sort of smart cities and districts and so forth, indeed in China, among other places, I would kind of go door to door and say, you know, what's your kind of economic master plan? What's your vision? What are people going to do here? What are people going to be trained to do here? What's your niche in the global division of labor? And I would hear things like, oh, well, we're going to do Philips LED light bulbs, you know, because that's a job creating industry. We need it here. There's a demand for it in our country, and it's relatively, you know, high tech-ish. And I thought, okay, well, it makes sense for sure. But have you talked to Philips? Is Philips planning on expanding its presence here, or is that just your, you know, idea on paper? Like, no, you know, that's just what we think would be ideal. And eventually, in those same places, it evolves into, well, actually, it turns out we're going to be a center for video game development, right? And that's perfectly fine too. You have the large domestic demand. You have countries or companies that are thriving and innovating in those areas. They may even be funded, or, you know, by Rakuten out of Japan and so forth. And, you know, again, you just have to have that plan and probably have a backup plan as well if things don't quite develop the way you had in mind, because you've committed to a place, but you haven't necessarily committed to a strategy. So I think one has to, you know, have these be quite open and flexible and evolutionary, which is, you know, the true spirit of what cities have been. But you know, let me just go back to one point, which is on demographic scale, because this concerns you and me both as well, which is that, you know, it's fine to have a smart city district somewhere, you know, call it take a Masdar in Abu Dhabi, you know, to pick one of many off the top of my head. You know, the population of Masdar today isn't a whole lot more than it was like 10 years ago right now. And that number is kind of smaller than my block here in Singapore, right? Like the total number of people live there. So, you know, again, I have no qualms about repeating this point. I'm concerned about billions, right? I do love the novelty and the scientific importance, you know, of demonstration projects in governance and technology, where you can have spillover effects and promote those lessons to larger cities and to countries around the world. I believe very, very strongly in that. And I believe that osmosis is happening. There's no question. The largest case of it in human history is self-evident. It's Singapore's influence on China, right? You know, a lot of people say small countries have no influence on big countries. I was like, really? And how come the largest country in the history of humanity has taken as its role model one of the smallest countries on earth? How do you reconcile that? You know, it's so blindingly obvious that China wants to be a collection of Singapores. And China is so far along in the process of becoming a collection of Singapores that one of the biggest fears in Singapore is that China doesn't need Singapore anymore. And all of this is actually common sense to even the taxi driver on the street in the country that I live in. So it's a mystery to me why more people don't understand this. You know, so again, you know, I think that clearly then demonstration projects matter because I live in one. You know, a place that really did not, you know, take novel approaches to many areas like public housing and foreign investment regulation and the alignment of education with you know, sort of industrial priorities. A lot of that stuff, you know, went surprisingly well, but was quite experimental as it unfolded here.
Okay, so it seems that a lesson for city builders is threefold. Geography is destiny, connectivity is destiny, and now, according to your book, mobility is destiny. And we need to account for all of those in order to make a successful project.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Excellent. Dr. Khanna, thank you so much for joining us on the show. And yeah, everyone, thank you for joining the show and listening to Dr. Khanna. Please check out his book and all of his work, and see you next time. Thank you, Dr. Khanna.
Thank you so much. Great to see you.